Hi, so here we are at the Cambridge Police Station, and we're going to go take a tour of the identification lab. Come with me. So would you mind showing us around and telling us what each of these pieces of equipment does?
Definitely. All right, we'll start here and work our way around. This is a fuming chamber, and we use this when we're doing fingerprint processing. What they found is when you heat super glue, the fumes that come off will adhere to any residue that's in a fingerprint on a piece of evidence, and it'll create these white ridges and make the print technically fixed. And then that way we can do other types of processing, which will go through the dusting or using certain chemicals. This item is a drying chamber. What we do with this is any evidence we collect, as you can see we have a piece of evidence in there, from a scene, maybe it's wet, maybe it's bloody, we want to make sure that it's properly dried before we package it. So this is, we clean this out, we sterilize this, we'll dry it, make sure it's completely dry, take it out, and then package it. This is probably the most important thing here because it helps with the chain of custody as evidence, as you've probably seen in TV shows that they always talk about chain of evidence. So what we have here are different lockers. On the other side of that is property, where all the evidence is submitted, whether it be from us, a detective, or a patrol officer. So they will submit it to us. We can take it out, start to process it. When we're complete, put it back in here, and it'll go back to property. We can do everything without having to ever leave the secure lab.
Interesting.
This, nothing fancy, it's just a hood. We use this just for safety measures. We do every type of chemical processing for prints in here. This is just a smaller version of the fuming chamber, which we've seen over there. And this is just another self-contained hood, and we use this for any type of powders that we use to process evidence.
Great. And so when a piece of evidence comes in, would you mind showing us, kind of walking us through the steps that would occur to that evidence?
Sure.
Great.
This is Diana. She works in our lab. She helps me process evidence, and she's going to be going through the steps. So if you want to grab evidence, we'll walk through the steps. So as we talked about before, we're going to take the evidence out of our lockers. We're going to make sure that every piece of evidence that we get in is properly packaged. We always use paper, and that it's sealed and it's initialed across the seal. That helps us with the chain of custody. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut the piece of evidence, cut the paper bag in a spot that's different from where it had been sealed. We're going to view the evidence to see if we can see any fingerprints or any blood first before we do anything else. We want to be careful where we touch the evidence. We don't want to smudge any prints or wipe off any other type of saliva, blood that may be on it. The next step we're going to do is document the evidence. We do this with everything. We measure it. We're going to describe the piece of evidence, and then we're going to photograph it. This is the most important part of probably crime scene processing and crime scene investigation altogether. So we're going to use we're going to take a photograph of every side, the evidence, and then also use a scale. After we've completed all the documentation, our next step is to determine how we're going to process the evidence. We have different techniques. everything that is porous, we would use the different chemicals, for instance, ninhydrin, which I'll show you later. Non-porous items, such as the glass that we have, we're going to fume it first, and then we can either use another type of chemical, or most likely we'll use the powder. This is the fuming chamber, and this is what we're going to use the super glue for, which is going to create the white ridges when it's heated, when the super glue is heated. So we use a little tin, and we place about a nickel to a quarter size, depending on how much evidence we have in the tin. The tin is then placed on a hot plate. We always make a test print on the glass so that we make sure that the super glue...
I'd love to.
Now we can check and see when the process is complete, and to make sure that it actually worked. So a lot of times we won't have prints on evidence. It's a lot of different factors come into place. So we want to make sure that the actual machine and the super glue is all working fine. We have a certain humidity set. What that does is just add moisture, kind of brings back the ridges that are in the print so that the fumes from the super glue can adhere to them. We just push start. Once it gets up to the certain humidity that we have set, it'll start heating the super glue, and we will start to see the fumes.
And great, so how long do you think that process will take?
It depends. It could take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes.
So let's come back here in a few minutes and see what's happened.
Great. We're back to the hood again. What we have is a mock piece of evidence, a bank robbery note example. It's on paper, so we're not going to be fuming it using the powder. We're going to use a chemical. This one is known as ninhydrin. The ninhydrin, you can either dip it, the evidence in it, or spray it. The ninhydrin will react with any amino acids that might be in the prints. And what we'll see in a few minutes is that we'll get almost a purple color. Diana is completely saturating the paper. It has acetone in it. It'll dry very fast. What it does is the ninhydrin, the chemical, reacts with amino acids. To enhance the print, it'll turn it a purple color, any fingerprints. We have all different other chemicals that we can use, and each one is going to react with a different component in the fingerprint residue.
Great, so we'll be able to come back in a couple minutes and see the prints? Fantastic.
Here we have a chart showing different techniques that we can use depending on the piece of evidence that we have. Let's say we have a plastic bottle. What we would do first is visually look at it, see if we can see anything right away. There might be a print that we don't need to do any type of processing with. If we don't see anything, we can move along to different steps, and if we don't see anything with these steps, we can move on to the next step and possibly get a print where we wouldn't have seen it using the small particle reagent, for example. And for different evidence, there's different techniques. There's all different surfaces that we can get prints off of. You could even get prints off of the sticky side of tape. You could get it off evidence that's been wet. So the sky's the limit. Let's take a look back at the evidence that we sprayed with ninhydrin and see if we can see anything. And as you can see, the purple are ridges, and we have a fingerprint. And we might be able to match that up with whoever robbed the bank. So let's get back to our evidence that we had in the fuming chamber. I
Great.
think it's about done. Diana's going to take the evidence out and first look at it to see if we can see any prints after we fume it. If we do, we always want to photograph it, document it every step of the way. And it looks like she has some prints on there. So now the next step is to decide if we're going to use a powder or we're going to use a dye stain. We're going to use a black powder. We're going to use black powder for this step. Little powder goes a long way. So we just need a little bit on it, and we gently swirl the brush over the surface. And it looks like we can see prints. We can see them even better after we've added the powder. Almost to our last step. What we would do again with this is we would take photographs of it, and then we would use tape, and we would actually lift the print off.
Great.
And we are complete with that piece of evidence.
Wonderful. And now how about this gun that's been left in the fuming chamber?
Gun? Well, so first we're going to take a look and see if we see any prints on it. So there's one right here. See how this is a textured surface? It's very hard to get prints off of that. The textured surface interrupts the flow of the ridges. You can see we have some ridges right around this area. Now we'll look at the other sides, making sure we cover all areas. And I'll let you look at it too. I don't see anything else.
I don't either. So given that we can't see any prints in the ridging area, is there anything else that can be used for?
Yes. What we can do with this now is swab it for DNA. What they've been able to do with all the advances is, think of it, if you're the person, if you're the shooter holding this gun, hopefully you're not going to have gloves on. You're going to be holding it, you're going to be sweating, you're going to rub off skin cells onto the surface. We call this, we can swab for what we call handler DNA or touch DNA because we can't visually see it. We always use sterile water and swabs. Changing our gloves at every step that we do. Just won't do that. Our first swab we're going to take is a control swab. We want to make sure that our water is not contaminated. So, just a drop or two, and that's all we need. We would seal this back up with evidence tape and then put it in another paper bag. We're going to add a little bit more water, and then we're going to go around the different surfaces that we would expect the handler of the gun to have touched the most. We're going to get in there and cover as much surface as we can. We're also going to do the trigger and the slide. All right, even though this looks sturdy, it shouldn't inhibit the DNA. Just like we did with the control, we're going to package it up seal it, and put it in another paper bag.
Great.
We can also swab the magazine or the rounds, and also any shell casings that we may have collected from the scene.
Are there other items other than guns that you might find at crime scenes that you would swab?
Yeah, we have a number of different items. More often what we would see here is a plastic bottle. So let's say we found this at a scene and it's empty, and the victims say that it's not theirs. We might assume that it's the suspect.
Mm-hmm.
So after we do all the fingerprint processing that we went through, we could go around the outside and the inside of the opening and swab it.
How effective is that typically?
We get very good results with this. We would get more results with this versus swabbing the gun.
Mm-hmm.
We also will get evidence in that may have blood or other biological fluids on it. Just like we would swab the bottle, we could swab anything from blood, or even if we don't see blood, we could still swab the blade and we might be able to find the victim's DNA. We could also take a swab of the handle and look for the handler touch DNA, which we talked about with the firearm. All right, now that we've finished all the evidence, you can get an idea of all the different techniques that we can use, including swabbing for DNA. Let's get to the final step. Let's pretend that we found a fingerprint on a piece of evidence that was collected at a scene.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to match it up to a suspect, but we had also found blood at the scene, and we sent that to our state lab to do DNA testing. So now we've come up, because of our fingerprint hit that matched to somebody, now we have a suspect.
Mm-hmm.
And as we had sent evidence to the state lab, they're going to want to know if we have any suspects or defendants, so they can match that up to the DNA the DNA profile
Mm-hmm.
that they found on our evidence. So they're going to ask us for a DNA standard. This is a DNA standard collection kit that we would use to swab, or let me say that we would use to collect DNA. We break the seal. There's information on the card that we have to fill out before we can send this to the lab.
Mm-hmm.
And inside, you can see there's a little card, has a circle on it, and all we need to do is take the swab that we collect and place it on the card. When it turns white, we know that we have enough DNA, enough saliva, and we can send this to the lab.
Could we do a test to see what this
Yeah,
would actually look
yeah.
like? Should I be the
This will be
suspect
fun.
today?
Yes.
All right.
We have just a big Q-tip, and we're going to have you open your mouth
All right.
wide. What I'm going to do is swab the cheeks,
Okay.
swab your tongue, and then have you place it under your tongue for about 5 seconds.
All right.
So it's kind of like I'm brushing your teeth. We want to try to make sure to get as much saliva and skin cells. Okay, I'll do your tongue now. And we'll put it under your tongue, just like we're taking your temperature. Okay, that should be about good.
So now we'll see if we got enough.
Yep, exactly. Just kind of blot it on the paper, and you can see that it's starting to turn white.
And so then this card is all that you would send to the lab?
Yep, this is all they need. All right, this is just about all white. It looks like we have enough on there.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for showing us around today. It was great to be able to see all these different techniques that you guys use to isolate both fingerprints and DNA from crime scene evidence.
I'm glad you could come.
Thanks.
Where all the evidence is submitted, whether it be from us, a detective, or a patrol officer. So they will submit it to us. We can take it out, start to process it. When we're complete, put it back in here, and it'll go back to property. We can do everything without having to ever leave the secure lab.
Interesting.
This, nothing fancy, it's just a hood. We use this just for...
So would you mind showing us around and telling us what each of these pieces of equipment does?
Definitely. All right, we'll start here and work our way around. This is a fuming chamber, and we use this when we're doing fingerprint processing. What they found is when you heat super glue, the fumes that come off, make sure that it's properly dried before we package it. So this is, we clean this out, we sterilize this, we'll dry it, make sure it's completely dry, take it out, and then package it. This is probably the most important thing here because it helps with the chain of custody as evidence, as you've probably seen in TV shows that they always talk about chain of evidence. So what we have here are different lockers. On the other side of that is property. Will adhere to any residue that's in a fingerprint on a piece of evidence, and it'll create these white ridges and make the print technically fixed. And then that way we can do other types of processing, which will go through the dusting or using certain chemicals. This item is a drying chamber. What we do with this is any evidence we collect, as you can see we have a piece of evidence in there, from a scene, maybe it's wet, maybe it's bloody, we want to make
Hi, so here we are at the Cambridge Police Station, and we're going to go take a tour of the identification lab. Come with me.